Welcome everybody to the next Inclusive Sussex in Conversation event, which I hope, as you all know, is on intergenerational justice and equality. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce the panel who are here, which I will in a moment. I'm also delighted to see so many of you here, which is fantastic. But we have this curse with Inclusive Sussex in Conversation, which is every time we have an event, it rains. Which is a discouraging event for us. But notwithstanding the rain, you're here, so I'm really pleased and grateful. My name is David Ruebain. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Culture, Equality and Inclusion. In a second, I will introduce my colleagues. Just to give you a brief outline of the evening, we're going to have a conversation about intergenerational justice for roughly an hour, perhaps a little less than an hour. Then there's time for a Q&A from any of you. Please do think about things that you want to say or talk about in relation to this important issue. And then around 7 o'clock we'll wrap up and there's a reception. See some of you have already managed to find that, which is fantastic. There will be more of a reception afterwards. Please hang around for a drink and a chat, and all of us will be around if you want to chat to us individually in that way as well, and then we'll wrap up around 7:30. So I'm going to introduce everybody very briefly, but I'm going to ask them to say something about themselves. I'll start at the end here. It's Professor Janet Boddy. Is it Boddy or Boddy? Boddy. Professor Janet Boddy, who is Professor of Child, Youth and Family Studies, one of our professors in education and social work. Do you want to say a little bit, Janet, about your subject discipline?
Yeah, so a lot of my research is related to children, young people and family lives. I co-founded our University Centre of Excellence now in Childhood and Youth, CERC, along with some other faces that I can see here. My own work is very much about support for children, young people and families, and particularly particularly relevant to our conversation tonight is work that I've done with young adults who were in care during childhood and understanding the challenges that they face in their lives and the role of support within that.
Thanks very much. And then Matt Johnson, who's one of our postgrad research students and also Director of Research or Head of Research at the Runnymede Trust.
Yeah, so Matt Johnson, is Head of Research at the Runnymede Trust. Well, some people say that I look young, but actually, yeah, some people say that. Well, sometimes in Sainsbury's I actually get ID'd sometimes. I've actually been in research probably about 15 years. I was counting the years on the way back. I sort of started in 2009 with sort of working actually on the youth agenda in Sierra Leone and then in Namibia. So I have quite a mixed sort of research background where I started off with in the sort of international development sphere and then moved more locally, working with local institutions, local and regional institutions like the West Midlands Combined Authority and economic-based, policy-based research organizations there. And then started to move into the more academic sphere, working with some universities, and most recently have been sort of head of research of a couple of organizations, one of them being the Runnymede Trust, where I am now. So, yeah.
And Matt, your research here, your PhD?
Yeah, so and again, me loving this connection between the international and the local. My PhD is actually on international education, and it has a focus on some of the things we're talking about today, largely around sort of youth and institutions, and in that sense there. So, yeah, looking forward to talking with you all and having a conversation with you all.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah. Dr. Omar Khan. Omar and I have known each other for a long while now, it's a title I can never remember, TASO. It runs TASO, and Omar will tell you about that. But I knew Omar when he was director of the Runnymede Trust, which is the, like where Matt works, which is the oldest race equality organisation in the country, I believe. Is that right?
Possibly, 1968 is the founding date of Runnymede. Yeah, it's great to be with Matt. I haven't been ID'd. That was too, enthusiastic a laugh, audience. I started Runnymede Trust in 1999, so not even this millennium. So, but I have been the chief exec of the Center for Transforming Access and Student Outcomes in Higher Education, which, as David says, I will proceed to call TASO the rest of the night because that's too much of a mouthful. We focus on tackling inequalities in higher education, so principally looking at inequalities that students experience from access, so who gets into university, to the student experience, how you get on once you get through the door, but also on the labor market end, because obviously we see differential outcomes for different kinds of students. So the university experience is obviously often a positive one, but obviously there are inequalities that affect people's ability to access, but also their ability to get the most out of their experience, which also then impacts not just their outcomes in the labor market, but I think obviously their children's outcomes too. So that's me, yeah, I think that's enough.
Great, thanks, Omar. And so moving this way, Emily Danvers. Emily, you're Senior Lecturer in Higher Education Pedagogies in ESW. What's Higher Education Pedagogies?
Well, I don't exactly know why I got that title, to be honest. Does that mean I know the best how to teach pedagogy? I have no idea. Why do I do that? I don't know. My research area is higher education, and I teach on a higher education pedagogy course, so perhaps that's why. I have probably been asked, I don't know, am I an older millennial? Maybe that's why I was picked. But I'm here because I've always had an interest in inequalities broadly in education. I've done all different things, things around widening participation and evaluating that. I suppose broadly I'm interested in what happens when students get here. So I'm interested in pedagogy and student learning and those sort of everyday experiences of feeling included or excluded, which I've done research on and I've done EDI work on too.
Thanks, Emily. And then Professor Nicola Dandridge has an extraordinarily long CV, and I'll just pick out a couple of, 3 or 4 things. Nicola and I first knew each other when we were both equality lawyers in 1843, and that's me. Nicola's much younger than I am. Ran Equality Challenge Unit, which was the UK higher education sector's EDI policy and research agency. Then ran Universities UK, which is the Vice-Chancellor's representative body, and then was the first chief executive of the Office for Students, which is our regulator, and is now Professor of Higher Education Practice at Bristol. Have I got the title wrong?
Slightly, not that it matters terribly much. It's a Professor of Practice.
Professor
of Higher Education Policy, because I'm not an academic background, as you.
And
a detail.
What's your interest in intergenerational justice?
Well, there's a question. And it's worth saying David and my careers have sort of tracked each other to the weirdest degree. So when I was working as a lawyer way back when, I was working for trade unions specialising in equality and equal pay and discrimination law. It was round about that time that age discrimination legislation was introduced. So it came in with a set of regulations in 2005?
Yes.
Yeah. And what was fascinating then was that we were really focusing on protecting disadvantage largely for older people. That was very much the agenda, with some quite sort of powerful representative lobby groups pushing for this new area of legislation, which then got enacted. And I found it really interesting, but at the time it was really about protecting old people. And I think what's so fascinating, and this is the discussion we were having, David, the other day, it's just reversing now, because if you stand back and look at where disadvantage lies, and this is something clearly we're going to be talking about this evening, still older people maybe, but it's much more complicated than that. And the disadvantage faced by younger people, I think it's kind of overwhelming. That wasn't the agenda back then. So I think it's just fascinating to see how the whole agenda has shifted, which is why I was really keen to come and contribute to this discussion, hear your views.
Thanks, Nicola, and thanks, everyone. I should have said this earlier, the very, very rough format is that we have all identified 4 or 5 themes that we're going to try and explore, very loosely explore. We may run out of time and not get to all of them, but we'll try and think about each of those in turn, and hopefully there's lots of food for thought for all of us in the room. And we're going to start with this idea of generational differences in the way that we think about society. So how does different generations, if that is the case, conceptualize society and our relationship, each of our relationship with society? And I wanted to begin with a HEPI report, Higher Education Policy Institute report. It's actually quite old now, a year and a half or 2 years, which was a report on students' views. And it was around the intersection of free speech and equality or inclusion. Just some data, it found that students were significantly less supportive of free expression than had been the case in the past. 79% of students believe that students that feel threatened, 79% of students believe that students that feel threatened should always have their demands for safety respected. And that was up from 68% 4 years before. While 4% disagree, down from 10% 4 years before. The proportion of students who believe universities are becoming less tolerant of a wide range of viewpoints has risen to 38%, up from 24%, and the proportion of students who agree that if you debate an issue like sexism or racism, you make it acceptable. So debating those issues, make it acceptable. That doubled to 35% from 17% 4 years earlier. So this appears to suggest a palpable shift in perspectives around the value of speaking as against the value of protection or the value of safety. And then I think there are interesting changes in what safety means as well for people. Relatedly, and I'll just throw this in because I think it's important, there's more and more research that safety is closely negatively correlated with loneliness and anxiety. That's probably not surprising. And now 1 in 5 students say they feel lonely every day. So is there something in all of that? Is there something in the atomization of society which has resulted in these changes in how we understand things? I don't know who I'm looking at here, but I'm curious as to any thoughts.
I'll jump in.
Please do,
like.
Janet. Yeah.
I think it's really, I think we have to be really careful about, as people from an older generation, and I'll include myself in that, who never gets asked for ID and haven't since I was about 15, that it's very easy to problematize the perspectives of younger generations and to, it's very convenient, I think, for older generations and politicians and policymakers in older generations to then attribute problems like loneliness, there were figures published just this week with a massive growth in poor mental health amongst young adults in society, such that young adults are now, I think, the largest group out of the workforce because of mental health. And, it's very convenient to individualize that, to blame that on wokeness, on concerns about safety, rather than recognizing intergenerational injustice, rather than recognizing the multiple ways in which, if I was to kind of misquote Isabel Laurie, who's a German political theorist, that those who hold power make others precarious in order to protect their power, in order to protect their situation in society. And I think that's what we see playing out on an intergenerational scale, not just in this country, but it happens globally, and we see it happening around issues like climate change as well. That, you know, if young people feel unsafe, if they feel precarious, then they're probably fairly accurately judging situations that are produced in the interests of older generations. And I think we have to listen respectfully to that and not do the kind of, oh, well, you know, maybe you're too, the kind of wokeness argument, that maybe you're too sensitive.
So Nicola, I think this speaks to the point that you were making earlier about the focus back in the day when equality legislation was evolving on older people with age, but now it's flipped. Right, I agree with you, by the way. I think, I mean, there's more that we might say about this, about the massive disadvantage that young people face, existentially almost. But maybe say some more about how you got to that thinking.
Well, the evidence speaks for itself, actually, in terms of disadvantage of younger people. In terms, there was a recent very good article in the Financial Times that got quite widely reported, which just acknowledged the extent to which now, for the first time, younger people are not looking to the future in a positive way, and they think that their economic and social circumstances are likely to regress, not progress, and that's a huge shift. And there's sorry, this is slightly off point, but there's a really interesting correlation with political voting intentions there, in that there is, and I think this is quite worrying in terms of fragmentation of society, that 1 in 10 young person, I can't remember how they define young, will vote for the Conservatives compared to what it was before. I mean, that's a tiny number, so whereas older people will in larger numbers. So we're fragmenting to a quite alarming degree, reflecting increasing disadvantage for younger people in terms of finance, economy, and, you know, all sorts of things. Can I just come back to the freedom of speech point on this, because it is relevant. If I think back to when I started as a lawyer, it was all very straightforward. Relatively straightforward. There was a much greater sense of wrong and right, a lack of nuance, I think, with hindsight. We never then talked about colonialism, colonizing society. It just wasn't on the agenda. I think and things were binary. I think that made it easier for us to advocate for the power and importance of free speech in that context. Now, things are so much more sophisticated, so much more complex, and what I picked up from that HEPI survey is that the students who were interviewed were acknowledging the complexity, really, of the environment in which people who are disadvantaged and disempowered are somehow expected to speak openly about really contentious subjects. I don't think that's possible in the way that it was. So I think the two things relate. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll stop there, because otherwise I'm dominating too much. But
yeah, I'd agree with that a bit. But I'd also, I more than a bit, I definitely agree with that. The other thing I think that intersects is the attitudes and the policy, and Nicola was sort of pointing to that, or the attitudes and the sort of conditions, right? So people hold attitudes about the world, but not merely because, you know, they don't pick them up from nothing. It's related to their experiences. And young people do have a harder time, for example, of getting property, owning a house, those kinds of things. The cost of higher education is obviously higher. And so you would expect sort of people's conditions and circumstances to affect their attitudes as well. So I do think there's a question there. If you look at young people's attitudes, not merely on those issues, which are different to the older generation, if you look at their attitudes around things like, should the state do more to redistribute taxation? They hold much different views. In fact, the gaps there are bigger than the gaps on some of the sort of hot button kind of culture war issues. So there's a larger gap between young and old people on some of the economic views than there is on the culture views, which isn't something that you hear about as much, although it does feed into Nicola's point around voting. And it is something that I worry about even in my role in terms of trying to expand higher education access. Fundamentally, older people are paying more in taxes. They do vote, and so that does inform and influence democratically the policy agenda, right? And if we want to expand higher education, for example, that is going to require people who are currently paying taxes to agree that that's a good thing. And the more that we have division between younger and older people, the harder it is going to be to make the argument that we ought to expand higher education, ought to invest in younger people's skills development, for example. This isn't even just an issue around higher education, even in terms of people who, non-graduates, right? Because there's all the people who don't get a degree, who actually the cuts to FE, and I'm sure Nicola knows this more than I do, have been much greater than the problem in HE. There's been a clear lack of investment in skills for people in their 20s. And so these are things that obviously feed into the way in which people understand and view the world. So it makes sense in some ways. I think one thing that is distinctive about the current, maybe not distinctive, but does seem different. Historically, it's been the case that people's attitudes drift slightly more conservatively as they get older. So you have a cohort effect, and you have a kind of aging effect. So the cohort effect is like people who were born before, sort of 20 years before the Second World War, all experienced rations. And so that whole cohort had a particular view, for example, about investing in the NHS. So all of that generation had a view, and that generation, even as they aged, they held that view. So that's a kind of cohort effect of aging. The other thing is people get more conservative as they age, and that has tended to be the case not just in Britain but elsewhere. That's starting to break down. We're starting to see strong cohort effects, both for people in millennials, but even the next generation, not my generation. So people in their 40s as well are not drifting in the way that the sort of 20 years ago 40-year-olds would have drifted. So that also, I think, creates some concerns around, are these intergenerational conflicts going to become sharper as, those cohorts, or arguably as in 20 to 40 years' time, it might be better because the cohorts will have more shared views. But that's a long time to wait, and we've got, in the meantime, the people who do contribute more, who do tend to vote more, who do seem to have more control over policy decision making. And finally, I'm sure Matt might pick this up as well. The demographics of these groups is quite different as well. So there are other reasons why you might expect. Obviously, there's more diversity. There's a larger proportion of Black and Asian minority ethnic people in the younger generation than there is in the older generation. And so, those are mapping onto other issues too, which is, I think, amplifying it, and in some ways, turning what isn't always an intergenerational issue into an intergenerational issue. So I think that's a major problem as well.
I'm really curious on your thought about to hear your thoughts, Matt, on these points, and particularly thinking about what Omar says. It seems to me that we've got this kind of perfect storm of the issues that are raised. Climate change has been mentioned, growing precarity and insecurity economically, what I think is part of the consequences of late-stage capitalism, or the state that we're in terms of those kind of meta issues. Do you see any of this in your research? And,
I think Omar, as you highlighted there, I think we often talk about, youth in terms of a monolith in that sense. We talk about the young people, the youth in that sense. Whereas it's not as simple as that. It's not as these things are complicated by geography, by place, by class, and by race and ethnicity as well. And that uniquely impacts people's experience of the world. Omar, you said that there's also sort of aging even within sort of different ethnic groups, there's aging populations, say within sort of Caribbean groups and white communities, but you look at average ages of, say, the Nigerian communities, some of those go down as low as sort of 17 and 18. So so you find high proportions of groups in those areas. And then, as you say, that it is very convenient to, individualize some of these issues around precarity and insecurity and loneliness when you have a sort of context of housing inequality, of job polarity, but job polarization, and also extractive economy, which is it has entrenched inequality significantly. and whereby young people tend to be actually at the sharpest end of that, and these middle jobs, where jobs are being increasingly put into the growth in terms of the high paid or the low paid sort of jobs there as well, and young people again are disproportionately affected by those. So yes, it is very important to take sort of a systemic, institutional sort of focused and think about how can we reimagine and transform systems for the future.
Yeah. If I can
Sure,
come
please
back
do.
on that, yeah, totally agree with you, and I think this is something that the work that we've done with young adults who are care experienced really highlights, because actually if you think about intergenerational justice, you also have to think about intergenerational care and connections. And what's happening in that context that you're describing is that young people who have support increasingly rely on scaffolding and support that crosses generations. So the intergenerational care is there, but it's, as you say, it's individualized, it's familiarized, it's kept through inheritance, through housing support, financial support, emotional support. And what that does then is exacerbate the inequalities that are faced by young adults who can't rely on those resources, whether because they're care experienced or whether for any other reason. So you see this kind of heightening of inequality. And I think it's interesting, that question about how attitudes to intergenerational transfer through taxation, for example, might be changing with older generations, because perhaps there is a recognition that, if you have children who are graduating from university with £60,000 each of debt, what does that mean for you as a family? What does that mean for your retirement plans? So maybe that's part of what is motivating older generations to say, well, is this all my responsibility, or does the state have a role to play in this?
I wanted to move us on to the related issue of policy and regulation. And actually, you've picked up some of these, Omar, but it seems to me from the discussion that we were having that I don't want to oversimplify, but if it really is the case that there is, one could argue that small c or big C conservative perspectives is more and more for older people, and otherwise not conservative positions are more and more for younger people. What does that mean for government policy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it is tricky, especially when that maps onto voter turnout, et cetera, like things like that. So obviously, there's going to, we're seeing it a bit with the pension triple lock, which is, Labour has now come out in favor of that as well. And I'm not saying that shouldn't be a policy, but you don't see anything commensurate for younger people. Like, where's the offer for young people? It's fine to say, and I agree with it, that we should ensure that older people don't live in poverty, but you're not seeing similar consensus, and you're not seeing similar kind of policy commitments, real kind of commitments by either party about what they're going to do about the cost of living crisis for young people. For example, the sort of bursaries that are available for people at university, the cost of living of rent, it hasn't, the grants that are available to people haven't matched the rise in the cost of living, whether that's rent or whether that's food. Never mind things like going out. So if you're worried about your housing and that, then obviously, and it relates to your point around, I suppose, even loneliness, is that obviously if you're having to spend more money on those basic necessities, you're not going to be able to do, not even very luxurious things, just basic things like meeting a friend for a coffee, right? So I do think it has these wider effects. On regulation too, I think it's quite interesting, and I don't have a strong view, but both of you are equality lawyers, and others of you might think that as well. I think there's also a sense that one of the big levers that we've had sort of historically and that we've really focused on, especially those of working in the space, has been the law, right? So you're asking about Runnymede founding. Well, Runnymede was founded partly because of the Race Relations Amendments Acts that were passed in the 60s. And then there was this view, and it was true, that there was no legislation on the books that outlawed discrimination. People know about those no blacks, no dogs, no Irish signs, but what they forget is they were perfectly legal There was nothing unlawful about publishing those signs. So there was a need, obviously, to pass this legislation. And I think, then you had the 76 Act, the Sex Discrimination Act 75, and then the disability and age and the expansion of that. And I'm still an advocate of that kind of arguably incrementalist approach of trying to protect individuals from discrimination. But, we've arguably hit the road on some of that, right? And even the story that I've just told, I think, overemphasizes the role of legislators and underemphasizes the role of ordinary people who, from bottom up, were telling the state, we're experiencing this discrimination. What are you going to do about it, right? And so that change that only happens through bottom-up action, I think, is something that we are seeing. But I think the links between that bottom-up action and policy decision-making is still quite tenuous and weak. And if anything, one of the concerns around young people being kind of ridiculed or stigmatized or thought of as kind of woke or snowflakes or whatever is their legitimate thoughts that they have. And this sort of, it's an important way in a democracy for policymakers not to be tone deaf and misunderstanding what the needs of the population are, is, bottom up, outside of elections, to listen to ordinary people. And I think that is something that arguably is going to become more prominent rather than thinking about change in equality through legislation and regulation. I don't know if the panel agrees, but I think that model has arguably gone as far as it can.
Absolutely, and I think going back to what Janet was saying earlier about one of the sort of negatives of this attribution of wokeness is one of the kind of positives of it, of course, is that young people are increasingly involved in social action and in activism. And I guess exactly what you're saying, that kind of infantilizing of it through identifying it as woke becomes, delegitimizes the genuine political concerns that young people are having and a right to voice.
Yeah, I think in terms of what it means for policy, I think there's specific legislation, but also what does it mean? I'm thinking, what does it mean for the policy process in that sense? As you mentioned there, we have there may be increases of social action, there may be increases of young people speaking out in that sense, but that linkage between that voice and policy decision making, in my view, is broken in that sense. So I think there are opportunities. Locally, regionally, I think taking power, having kind of local decision makers and feeling a sense of I can influence those. I can influence the economy when powers are sort of decentralized, and seeing those policymakers sort of on your doorstep and raising demands on that sense. I think there is some sort of maybe linkages in terms of opening up a more inclusive policy process through a more kind of localization and a more of a localization agenda there as well.
Yeah. I mean, you say, Matt, that the link between, I don't want to misrepresent you, the link is broken between young people's voices and impact.
It is, yeah.
That's a pretty depressing picture.
Yeah.
I'd be interested, what does the audience think? Raise your hand if you agree with that, actually.
Wow. Well, we might come back to that in the Q&A. The link is broken, and we do need to think carefully about how we open that up, and it's not with this kind of centralized focus, this hyper-centralized focus that is just purely with particular individuals from particular backgrounds, from particular universities. And who came from particular schools in Westminster. It doesn't seem to be, that's blocking the process. That's blocking the process. We need a more inclusive process. We need a process whereby people can relate to individuals within their political process as well. So we just need a more inclusive political policy process in that sense. Thanks. I want to mix us up a bit with some of our themes, because one of the things we were going to come to was access to university. So here's the question. Are universities just for the elite now, increasingly so, given the social and economic struggles, is that where we're moving?
I think a particular kind of experience is for the elite, certainly, yeah. I don't necessarily, I mean, the challenges students are facing are just insurmountable, I think, in terms of the cost of living crisis and balancing levels of study, the differences in the kinds of experiences other generations might have had, where you might have gone to a university, moved away to study, had this experience where you met friends and you did volunteering and you didn't work and you studied and you thought and you had to, that's just not the experience most of my students are having. I think a HEPI report, we're loving HEPI today, aren't we? We're not sponsored by them. A HEPI report said that 55% of young people, of students work now outside to fund or to partially fund their degree, and that's 2023 is the first time, I think it's the first time it's gone over 50%. So that's significant. So we know students are working. We also know many students are commuting. I don't know what the figure is, about a quarter to 20% of students are commuting to study, so we're not going away. So that really changes the kinds of engagements students are likely to have. So what happens is students are normally here, but some, because of those circumstances, are having much more fragmented relationships to their study, which can be a good thing in the sense that you're learning to manage multiple things and have these really flexible engagements with work and study and life. That's probably the reality you're going to be facing, but at the same time, there will be others that have a completely different experience, that are able to capitalise on more opportunities, and therefore, when it comes to the labour market, are one step ahead of you. And so that's the issue, that on paper, possibly they're not elitist, but it's the experience that you're going to have which will be completely different.
I mean, it's a febrile sector, is the higher education sector, in terms of change. And, you know, our current minister, one of our current ministers is his priority is degree apprenticeships, which is a different model. I think one of the things you've been talking about is the boarding school model changing. Nicola, do you see this in higher education?
Yeah, I think this is a real challenge. I remember talking to a Vice Chancellor a couple of years back saying, and he was saying that he saw increasingly that universities were engines of social immobility, not mobility. Because exactly as you said, Emily, the impact of university on certain demographic cohorts can be extremely positive, but it tends to accelerate advantage to a greater extent for advantaged cohorts rather than disadvantaged. So I think there is a real challenge about how we stop that. And as access expands, quite rightly, and as provision gets more fragmented and modular and hybrid and online and the whole lifelong learning agenda, all of which, by the way, I support. A, I support it. B, it's inevitable. But the real risk, I think, for the sector is that's just going to carry on dividing and exacerbating. Sorry, we're being incredibly negative this evening. Look, there is an opportunity in all of this that will take the lifelong learning agenda, that can really sort of reverse things. But I think the worry is, against the background of existing divisions, economic, social, cultural, that some of these trends are going to reinforce. And I think that's why it's so important that we're having this sort of discussion so that we're not just sort of pushed down the path of assuming higher education is automatically going to have a positive impact on cultural cohesion. I think we need to challenge that and ask ourselves whether it's actually having that impact, or whether some of these trends are not necessarily going to be positive unless we make the effort to reverse, which is exactly why, you know, the organisations, whether it's Runnymede or TASO, these are so important. We need to be supporting and giving voice to those organisations so that this agenda is more visible.
Yeah, I will, a little bit optimistic and a little different now, is, I mean, if you look at, for example, the proportion if you go back 50 years, the proportion of women who went to university was less than men. If you go back 20 years, the proportion of black students who went to university was much less. Those gaps have all narrowed. So I think there is an important positive story, especially for the young people in the room who are at university, or even those who are 10 years out. I mean, it is the case that the proportion of children on free school meals has doubled who attend university today compared to even 10 years ago. So it's gone from 12 to 25%. It's approaching 30%, in fact, in the most recent data. And I mean, just going back 25 years ago, only 30% of better off kids went to university. So we now are seeing some of the closure of the gaps, at least in terms of access. I do accept, of course, that the student experience and then the outcomes the other end are starting to diverge significantly, not least because of the cost of living. But if you look at the returns on degrees, even for free school meal kids who go to non-Russell Group universities, they earn significantly more per year and over the course of their lifetime than their peers who didn't go to university. So it is, university can't fix all of the social immobilities that we have in our society. It certainly can do better to fix the ones they've got. But, when employers choose to hire people from certain backgrounds, that's a decision that we do need to try to disrupt a bit, but universities have limited ability to do so. I do think, though, that at the same time, universities need to do more around that agenda and not be complacent. There is a little danger that we just, are encouraging universities to take more kids in and not then asking the question, well, what happens to them once they're here? And we shouldn't forget that second agenda, but we also shouldn't forget that we've had some success on the first. And I don't want to go back to a world where only the kids of kind of parents who went to university go to university. So that would be my slight positive pitch.
Tony Blair's famous wants 50% of young people to go to university. He recently, I think, adjusted it to 70%.
Well, it's going to hit 50%.
It's going to, whereas, of course, the current narrative is that there's far too many quote-unquote Mickey Mouse degrees, which always interest me because they talk about vocational degrees, but they never talk about getting rid of law and medicine, which are both vocational.
Yes, I don't want to trail. We're about to publish a report on some of this in a month around the retions of different degrees for different demographic groups, which is why it's on my mind.
Right, well,
so watch this space.
Wait, yes, bated breath.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to that report, actually, because, it sounds really interesting. I think I think we also have to think about the structure of the economy when we talk about the experience of students and the outcomes of students as well. Because even though, in general, there's a positive return of investment, I do think that is complicated by where you live, your local economy, whether what socioeconomic status, and how and where your university is, and the sort of labor market. There was some recent research that came out that actually, students from sort of poorer backgrounds and who in areas with labour markets that weren't as sort of developed to say as a London, or that didn't have those local economies, actually was ended up in kind of more lower paid jobs, and the return on investment was not as high as certain students that may have been say in London and with more organizations, more headquartered organizations sort of based in the capital, and with sort of poorer students unable to make the move and to transition and have that sort of internal sort of migration across the country, then it does become more of a complicated sort of picture there. We almost take it as a given that university is this great thing. I'm not saying it's a great thing. I'm in the university right now, so I'm not going to say it's not a great thing. But there are issues. There are issues. There's still issues with social mobility. And I think we need to look at this at kind of a place-based level, and also a race and ethnicity sort of level as well.
Yeah.
Matt, I know you wanted to talk about place and regionality, and I think this is. I think we're mixing up the themes. By the way, everyone, please do give us your thoughts on that, because I think that's key.
So again, it's funny. It's the key theme of the day for me. I'm going to be banging on about this a lot. Because I live in, as I say, I live in Wolverhampton. Born in a place called West Brom. It's not we didn't have the economy as London. I had to get have funds raised for me to do internships in London, or have or even attend an interview. There's times I had great job offers, and I remember not being able to travel down to. I had to reject it because I just couldn't. Just did not have the money to attend those job interviews. Even though I went to a Russell Group university, had the sort of qualifications, but yeah, I was just the jobs in my world were just not there. So this is very close to me. This kind of issue around sort of place. Space is very personal for me in that sense. That thankfully I had people that were willing to sacrifice even their last pennies for me to sort of make certain journeys. But not everybody has that. I know people that didn't really have any of those opportunities at all. Very intelligent, very bright people, but because of where they live, weren't able to have that sort of internal migration. And I just think the amount of sort of potential and the way that they could have thrived and their sort of life chances, can be hindered by that. So when we're having these discussions, again, oftentimes it's very easy to talk in a kind of heuristic, kind of general sense. But I always try to think about how is the nuance. How is it like where, in say a rural area or in a sort of working class area, where there aren't those sort of levels of opportunities as well. So that's my sort of thinking in that sense.
Well, you said something, if you don't mind me quoting you, Matt, that some of the places that have seen the biggest increases in their graduate share between 1993 and 2022 have seen the biggest falls in the share of graduates doing graduate jobs.
Yeah.
So I was trying to picture that. I mean, so where we've seen an accelerated growth in young people going to university, some of those places have seen the reverse happening.
I think this is a policy failure to an extent, though, too, right? I think, so with regional inequalities and particularly, so there aren't enough graduate jobs in some places, right? So people then either have to move or they have to take less pay, right? And that is a phenomenon in this country. The question then becomes, do we increase the supply? But there's also graduate cold spots. So there's places where there are relatively few graduates, for example, in the Northeast, in parts of East Anglia. And the question is, do we try to increase the supply of graduates? So encourage more 18-year-olds to go to university so that we have more graduates? Or do we actually have to do something around employers because there aren't enough graduate jobs in those places? And actually that, I think, is the bigger driver in our economy at the moment. And so there is a policy problem that if we're just trying to tackle one inequality, which is the proportion of disadvantaged young people in particular regions who go to university, by tackling that, and it's a good thing to tackle that. But if then when they when they finish their degree, there aren't local jobs for them, as Matt has described, that's what's happening. You're getting this higher increase of so you could argue that that's a policy success. We've widened participation, but we haven't done anything to change the structure of the labor market locally in that place. And so the place-based inequalities become, even worse.
It's basically seems to me to speak to a lack of an industrial strategy.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I'm always moaning about the industrial strategy as well. So it's a daily. I wake up and I say industrial strategy. So it's
I know what you mean. I sometimes worry that I'm becoming New Labour. Phrases like that, there's a lack of joined-upness. Maybe.
There is absolutely.
Which is one reason, actually, why there has been a lot of criticism about universities being positioned in the Department for Education as opposed to DSIT, with a much more closer alignment with industrial policies. I think there's a very strong case for that.
So we're in real danger of agreeing with each other about everything. So let me I want to bring in the final theme, which we may or may not agree with, which is about how we conceptualize equality in itself. And there's a lot that all of you have said which is challenging about certainly the models of equality that from when I was young and that I litigated about, really, particularly the kind of the siloed, nine-protected characteristics, and none of them include socioeconomic disadvantage, although that is in the Equality Act in sections 1 and 2, I will add. We got it in there as a public sector duty, although it's never been implemented. what does all of this mean for how we conceptualise equality? Nicola, I know you had some thoughts about this.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting issue, and we've been touching on it implicitly, actually, in the discussion this evening, just by raising issues of geography and location. What this is about, I think, is increasingly we're seeing, rightly, I think, people as individuals with a whole range of different attributes and characteristics, and intersectionality is rightly important, and we see individuals as having characteristics and identities in their own rights. And I think that's respectful and authentic and also accurate in terms of how, I guess, people perceive themselves. However, how the equality legislation was constructed and how things were conceived when I was a lawyer way back then, David too, and when the equality legislation was being drafted, was a very much greater focus on collective groups, and that's the point about indirect discrimination. And so, and also it's where I was coming from, working for trade unions. So you saw what the impact of policies were on groups. And on the one hand, I remember someone, this was when I was at the ECU, I was talking rather blithely about black attainment. And they quite rightly said that is stigmatizing, and talking in those terms reinforces lack of aspiration and attainment, which really sort of caught me short, and I think there's a very powerful point about that. But on the other hand, if you look at the statistics, they show that there are these trends in terms of whether it's black attainment or employment or whatever it is. And I think, I mean, this was really relevant in connection with the Stephen Lawrence Macpherson report. And I think that lesson is getting lost in all of this. So if you look at what happened, this is a crude summary of, I think, a really seminal report, and obviously a completely sort of traumatic set of events as well. But when the Stephen Lawrence murder was investigated in isolation, it was just treated as a murder, and it just sort of got lost in the mix, and nothing happened, and no one got convicted.
Well,
no.
Worse than that.
It was worse than that, actually.
Yeah.
Sorry, quite. Thank you. It was condoned, really, and not investigated properly. However, when you looked at the pattern of discrimination in terms of police behaviour, you realise that it wasn't being properly investigated because it was a black young man who was murdered. And that then led to the introduction of this concept of institutional racism. And it shifted the way we, I think, approached seeing things in collective terms, because it suddenly became immensely powerful, both in terms of the experience of black young men being murdered, and also in terms of, quite frankly, the corruption of the police at that point. Not corruption, but just a failure to investigate properly, which would have been missed if you'd seen his experience individually. So I think we've got a tension here. We've got to acknowledge the complexity of individuals and respect that. But the danger is, how do you do that without acknowledging the impact of the collective and collective behaviours? And I think we're in it's relevant to intergenerational equity. Do I treat this person as a young person with all the sophistication and complexity of their background and their identities, in the plural, or do I see that there are certain national policy trends which are impacting on them as a young person in a specific way? And so I don't know the answer to this, by the way. Clearly we need to do both, but how do we articulate that in a way that doesn't sound like complete and utter gobbledygook, and yet retains the benefits of both? So there we go.
Anybody got an answer?
I'll jump
Yes,
in
Janet.
if you like. I totally agree with you. I think it's both and I think actually that that case and that report is a really helpful example to think about. It reminds me of debates we have about which forms of knowledge can influence policy, and debates about qualitative versus quantitative research. And, you know, I always say, if I talk about that in my teaching, that you think about it as a zoom lens. You need the wide angle and you need the macro focus. And by looking at the detail through the macro focus of qualitative research, you can generate theory, you can understand complex processes, you can understand how policy at a macro level might best engage with intersectionality, with place as part of that intersectionality, so that you don't end up with models that are kind of one-size-fits-all, test this intervention with an RCT. Maybe it won't work very well for anybody, but we have a standard policy that we can roll out, versus needing the big picture knowledge, the analysis of trends and so on, so that you can understand what works. And I think we're in the same space here. So if I was to come back to being optimistic, I think, this stuff on a political level, that we may be quite limited in what we can do to change discourses about whether or not people should be going to university and so on, and the policies that fall out of that. But there are things that we can do as a university, as if I talk about myself as a teacher in a university, to make sure that my students feel included, to make sure, even if I go back to our £2 meal in the canteen downstairs, to make sure that students understand that the university recognises financial hardship and is doing what it can do to try and mitigate that a little bit, albeit imperfectly, because we have lots of other challenges around that. So I think we need the big picture and the macro lens zooming in.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody. Please do stay around. Please do chat. I found it really, really fascinating and interesting, and I really appreciate you being here. Can I ask everybody to appreciate our guests, some of whom have travelled quite a long way? Thank you. And please stay for a drink.